Almost 4 months ago, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain severed all diplomatic ties with Qatar and imposed a land, air and sea blockade on the country. The sudden move escalated a simmering feud between the Gulf states in what is a relatively stable area of the Middle East, having managed to avoid the political instability, terrorist insurgencies and civil wars that plague their regional neighbours.
I think the Qatar conflict is quite divisive and definitive and has forced countries to kind of show their hands in a way in terms of where they sit. Are they comfortable with Saudi dominance or Saudi backed by Egyptian dominance? Are they comfortable with a greater role for Turkey in the region? How does that relate to the Iranian role in the region?
So why would the Arab Quartet threaten the peninsula's stability and risk weakening the Gulf Cooperation Council that encompasses the Gulf states? Let's look at the economic and diplomatic structure of the region first. A rentier state is defined as a state which derives all or a substantial portion of its national revenues from the rent of indigenous resources to external clients. In the case of the Gulf, each state's economy is predominantly sustained by exporting their large oil and natural gas supplies. The resulting surplus of wealth means that states such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar don't need to tax their population in order to generate income revenue. Many analysts argue that this unique relationship between the regime and its citizens is what allows the hereditary monarchies in the Gulf to remain relatively unchallenged in power. By providing the population with those extensive benefits, an unspoken social contract is established. The regime is able to maintain power without citizens demanding greater accountability or representation within political leadership, which can often restrict the growth of democracy and free economic development. Saudi Arabia and Iran have the second and fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world, and as regional powers, both are constantly competing to exert their influence over the Middle East. The tension between the two nations dates back thousands of years to when the Prophet Muhammad's followers disagreed over who would be his rightful heir, which established the Sunni and Shia split in the Muslim faith that we see today. Saudi Arabia has a Sunni majority, while Iran's population is predominantly Shia.
I think that the critical relationship in the Gulf is the Saudi-Iranian relationship. Saudi makes all their calculations really with a view to Iran, and vice versa. The Iranians, it's all the decision making is worked through that metric.
The current struggle for power between the two countries significantly dictates foreign policy in the Middle East, and often manifests itself in regional proxy conflicts, which brings us to the Qatar crisis. Tensions between the Gulf states and Qatar had been present for a number of years, although analysts have highlighted a number of key events that might have led to the sudden escalation of the feud. In May, an official Qatari website was hacked into, and a statement was posted that communicated sympathy for Iran and its militant group Hezbollah. While Qatari officials condemned the statement as planted, Saudi and Emirati media outlets repeatedly projected the endorsement as factual. Days earlier, US President Donald Trump visited the Middle East and pledged support for Saudi influence in the region. Analysts have suggested that this could have inadvertently emboldened the Saudi regime to advance their attempt to restructure their influence of power in the Gulf. What followed was the four countries' decision to sever ties with Qatar and impose a diplomatic and trade blockade on the country, exacerbating a number of pre-existing tensions. Firstly, the Quartet has repeatedly accused Qatar of funding and supporting groups that they categorise as terrorist organisations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Secondly, Qatari-owned news outlet Al Jazeera has received widespread criticism in the Arab world surrounding accusations of selective reporting. The broadcaster was blocked in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE 2 weeks before the blockade was imposed. Lastly, Saudi Arabia in particular had become increasingly wary of Qatar's developing relationship with Iran, and perhaps saw the blockade as an opportunity to reinstate control over a state that they viewed as wavering and disloyal.
Qatar, on the back of its sort of growing wealth, sought to expand its influence throughout the region. Al Jazeera is a manifestation of that, but also courting independent relationships outside sort of the Saudi sphere of influence, particularly not just with Iran, but also with Turkey.
In order for the blockade to be lifted, the Quartet issued a list of 13 demands to the Qatari government. These included reducing diplomatic ties with Iran, ending domestic military cooperation with Turkey, severing links to all terrorist and ideological organisations, shutting down the Al Jazeera network, and aligning their social, economic, military and political ideals with those of the other Gulf states. The Qatari government has vehemently denied any support of networks that the states could have labelled as terrorist organisations, and officials maintain that they upheld predominantly commercial trade relations with Iran, after declaring that the blockade is an unjustified measure based on allegations that have no factual basis. Officials rejected the list of demands and emphasised that surrendering to the ultimatum would compromise this country's sovereignty. The blockade had the potential to have a devastating effect on Qatar's political and economic operations. However, the opposite seems to have resulted. The isolation has pushed Qatar to form closer diplomatic relationships with Turkey and Iran, who have both supported the country with shipments of fresh food and allowed Qatari airplanes access to their airspace. External mediation attempts by Kuwait, Germany and the United States have all failed, with both sides steadfast in the divisive feud that threatens to undermine the political stability of the Arabian Peninsula. We have to go to a break, but stick around as Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, a researcher and expert in Gulf politics, joins me to further discuss the complex relationship between the states in this unique region of the Middle East.